Hi, everyone. Welcome again to another episode of Anatomy. In episode 2, we'll be talking about the integumentary system. So let's get started. Okay, so this is the first of the 3 systems we'll be talking about. And the first major component of the integumentary system is the skin. So that's what we'll tackle first. So the skin is made up of several layers, and it's the largest organ in the human body. So I know we don't really typically think of the skin as an organ, but it is actually an organ, and it's very visible, and it's actually the largest by mass and by area. In general, it's about like 1.5 to 2 meters. And it actually plays many different roles in the body. It's pretty clear that it protects underlying structures, and it acts as a barrier between the inside of the body and the outside. But it also plays some other related functions, like, for example, immune defense. It's part of the first line of defense in the immune system through secretions, the sweat and the sebum that your skin glands produce have some antimicrobial properties, and your skin also harbors some phagocytes, which are immune cells that like engulf bacteria. It also does thermoregulation. So like when you sweat, that helps your body cool down from the water that's evaporating off of your skin. And when it's hot, some of your blood vessels toward the surface of your skin dilate, and that also helps you radiate heat. Vitamin D synthesis is also something that your skin does, as well as sensation. You have a lot of sensory receptors in your skin. Okay, so here's a diagram of the layers of the skin. So let's take a look at sort of some of its components. You'll notice that over here to the left, there are 3 main layers of the skin. The epidermis is what you see. It's the most superficial. Remember the terms that we learned in the last unit. It's the most superficial of the 3 layers of skin. So you have the epidermis. The dermis is right underneath that, and it's the thickest layer. The dermis itself is divided into the papillary layer, which is up here, and the reticular layer, which is down here, and that's wider. And beneath that is the subcutaneous layer. So of these, they have different properties. They contain different things. The epidermis, you'll see it doesn't really contain all of this stuff down here that the dermis does. The epidermis is actually mostly made up of cells, and it's actually a type of epithelium. Recall learning about epithelium in the previous lecture. And it's actually something called a stratified squamous epithelium. We'll take a look at that later. And the epidermis is also made up of several layers itself. The dermis is mostly made up of connective tissue, and it contains a lot of other different types of tissue within it. For example, you'll notice that the hair root is located within the dermis. You have a lot of blood vessels and some nerve endings right here in the dermis. All these sort of funny looking yellow things are sensory receptors. You have hair follicles also, as I mentioned. All of your glands are also located in this region, like your sweat glands and your sebaceous glands, which are attached to hair follicles. Also attached to hair follicles, you'll have erector pili muscles. And these are little muscles attached to the hair root that contract in certain circumstances, such as when you're frightened or when you're cold, and they produce goosebumps by making the hair stand up on end. And lastly, you have the subcutaneous layer, which is underneath that. And sometimes it's not really considered part of the skin because it's not like strictly skin. But basically, the subcutaneous layer is made up of adipose tissue, which is fat, and it's a type of connective tissue, and it acts as insulation. Okay, so zooming into the epidermis, notice that the word epi means above, and dermis is the other layer of the skin that we discussed. So the epidermis naturally will be above the dermis. Okay, so on the right-hand side here, you see a diagram with some more details about the epidermis and its layers. So there are 5 major layers of the epidermis, starting from the most superficial to the deepest. You have the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, the stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. They all serve different functions, and they're important to know, but I won't talk about them right now because it's a little more granular than I'd like to make this video, and it'll just take too long if I talk about everything. So feel free to look into this on your own time. It's very interesting to learn about how the cells go through this process of keratinization. So all of these cells are called keratinocytes, and they contain a protein called keratin. So keratin is a fibrous structural protein that gives skin its toughness and makes it sort of waterproof. As the cells sort of, they're born here down below in the stratum basale, and they proceed upward through the layers of the skin and end up at the stratum corneum where they're sloughed off. And as they proceed through this process, they gain more keratin, and that process is called keratinization. Um, Also in the stratum basale, you have melanocytes, which are shown here in green, although they're not actually green. And they produce melanin, which is a pigment that makes your skin whatever color it is. Also, I mentioned this earlier, but the epidermis is something called stratified squamous epithelium. So recall from the previous unit that epithelium is one of the four main types of tissue that covers surfaces. So your skin is obviously covering a surface, and the two words before that, stratified squamous, what does that mean? So stratified means that it has different layers. On the other hand, you might have simple epithelium, where you don't have stratification, you only have a single layer of cells. So that's not the case here. And squamous is referring to the shape of the cells. So if you'll notice here in the diagram, most of the cells have this sort of like flattened, like pancake-like shape. So that's what squamous means, they're flat. On the other hand, you might have cuboidal epithelium, where each of the cells looks like a little cube and they're like more round. Or you might have columnar cells, where they're taller than they are wide. So it's not the case here. Here we have stratified squamous epithelium, which is basically just a really fancy way of saying lots of layers of flat cells covering a surface. That's all there is to it. Okay. Next slide, we'll talk about the dermis. So as I said before, the dermis is consisting of two layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So the papillary layer is on top, and it consists of looser areolar connective tissue, and the reticular layer consists of dense irregular connective tissue. So both of them have proteins called elastin and collagen, and these are like keratin, they're fibrous structural proteins. However, the main difference between them, other than their function, but the dermis has elastin and collagen outside of the cells, whereas keratin is located within the cells. So what elastin and collagen do, well, for elastin, it's sort of in the name, it makes the skin elastic so that you can like stretch it and it won't like deform your skin. And it also keeps your skin hydrated. So you see like a lot of supplements being sold that contain collagen, that's supposed to like keep your skin young and hydrated and healthy. All right, and as I also said before, the dermis contains blood vessels, nerves, hair follicles, glands, and many sensory receptors. Also, one thing that you'll notice here is that the papillary layer has a sort of like wavy ridge to it. So like the darker pink stuff above this, that's not actually dermis. That's actually the stratum basale of the epidermis. And only this like lighter colored stuff beneath this curve is the papillary layer of the dermis. So those waves actually occur in thicker skin only, and that's what makes your fingerprints and like the little ridges on your hands. So yeah, there are two types of skin, generally thick and thin. Thick skin is located on your palms and your soles, and thin skin is everywhere else on your body. So only thick skin really has these like curvy ridges. So moving on to the next part of this video, we'll talk about accessory structures that are associated with the integumentary system. So first off, hair. Hair, as we said before, it has a root and it originates in the dermis. So here's a pretty comprehensive diagram of the anatomy of the hair. The part that's like sort of out of this like bulb region is called the hair shaft. And that itself has three layers, from inner to outer, the medulla, the cortex, and the cuticle. And all three of these are made of dead cells that contain keratin. And keratin, if you remember, is the same protein that's located in epidermal cells. So both hair and skin are made of the same protein, just sort of they look different because the cells are in different forms. Here's the muscle that's associated, the erector pili, and that's what makes goosebumps when they contract. Associated with the hair is this sebaceous gland, which makes oil. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And let's focus here a little bit on the hair root or the hair bulb. So the hair bulb is like specifically this roundish part inside the dermis, and it surrounds the hair papilla, which is this little bean-like thing at the very tip of your hair bulb. And that contains blood, which brings nutrients to the hair and facilitates cell growth. The hair matrix is also the region of dividing cells, and the hair bulb is protected by two layers of protection, the inner root sheath and the outer root sheath. So hair growth originates from this bulb region, specifically the hair matrix. And hair growth on a macro level occurs in three stages: anagen, catagen, telogen. And I think this might be misspelled, actually. That's my bad. It should be an O here instead of an E. But basically, you can remember this because they're in alphabetical order. Anagen is the longest stage of growth. So it's when the hair is actively growing and the hair contains its highest amount of melanin. So the hair is lengthening by being pushed up here by new cells of the hair matrix. Then in catagen, which we call the transition stage, the hair stops growing, but it just sort of stays there. It's not shed. And the follicle kind of like reabsorbs itself and starts to shrink, which you see sort of happening here. And then lastly, you have telogen, which is a resting stage of the hair. The follicle recedes and the hair sort of falls out in preparation for a new hair to grow in its place. Okay, so here's a cross section of the hair. So you're just like taking one piece of hair and like cutting it and putting it under a microscope to see what's going on inside. And this is actually like down below in the hair root. So that also includes like the stuff that we saw previously down here on the last slide. Okay, so these three layers inside that I'm sort of encircling here are the actual hair shaft itself. And that's formed by the medulla, the cortex, and the cuticle. Then outside of that, sort of this whole region, you have the follicle wall, which is only under the skin and the dermis. And in general, that consists of two layers. You have the external root sheath and the internal root sheath, the external one being a lot thicker. Outside of that, you have the peripheral connective tissue, which attaches the hair follicle to the dermis itself. So all of these components comprise the follicle wall. Okay, moving on next to the nail. The nail is an extension of the epidermis that covers obviously your fingers and toes. And that really serves a protective function and helps you manipulate objects better in your hand. So yeah, it's an extension of the epidermis in that it's also formed by keratinocytes, but all these keratinocytes are dead, much like in the epidermis, but they're like very compact and very hard, and they contain a high amount of keratin, which gives us its strong waterproof structure. This diagram shows some of the basic anatomy of a nail. And just like highlighting some important things, the nail body is like this plate, and it grows starting from the nail root, which is under the skin. That's covered by the proximal nail fold and the eponychium, which are like the skin sort of right at the tip of your nail. The hyponychium is like the thickened epidermis that's like right underneath your nail. This little white part on your nail that's also labeled here is called the lunula. The two sides of your nails are bordered by lateral nail folds. Remember from the previous unit that lateral means toward the side or like away from the midline. So like this isn't really the midline of your body, but it's the midline of the finger. So they're toward the sides. All right. So now we'll talk about some of the glands associated with the skin. So there are two main types of sweat glands. Both of them look kind of similar. They're like this little coiled up tubular gland that's located in the dermis. Okay, so the first type is called eccrine glands. These are the most common kind of sweat gland. So they're located all over your body, but they have the highest concentration in the palms and soles and sometimes the forehead. So like they're sort of everywhere, and they're constantly producing sweat. Eccrine glands are smaller in comparison to apocrine glands. the secretion that they produce is more liquid. And I just noticed I have a typo there. I apologize. They also empty directly into pores at the surface of the skin. So you'll notice here, just like tiny little holes, openings at the surface of your skin. And the secretions that they produce are odorless. This is in contrast to apocrine glands, which are the other type of sweat gland. They're located specifically in the armpits and groin area, and they're larger in structure and deeper. So they might sort of even poke into the subcutaneous layer and like be located down here-ish. Their secretions are more viscous because they have a lower water content and more proteins and lipids and other molecules. And they don't empty directly into pores. Actually, they empty into hair follicles, sort of like sebaceous glands. And they also have odorless secretions, but these, because they contain more molecules, they actually react with bacteria to form body odor. And their secretions are usually the result of stress or stimulation, whereas eccrine glands just produce sweat all the time. Apocrine glands are only the result of specific instances, and they're really activated at puberty. So before that, they aren't really super active. All right, the other major type of gland is sebaceous glands, which are associated with hair follicles. So the two little clusters of cells out here, those are the sebaceous glands. They secrete sebum, which we sometimes just refer to as like skin oil. So it's a lipid-rich secretion. And the function of that is to help lubricate and waterproof skin and hair. And this solution is slightly acidic, which helps thwart the growth of any bacteria that might be on the surface of your skin also. And the secretion of sebaceous glands is stimulated by hormones, and they are also usually activated only around puberty. All right, so that's the end of this week's video. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Anatomy. I hope you have a great day and take care. See you next week.